Well, there's nothing. Well, what's not legitimate is to pretend that that is what the referendum is about. There's nothing in the Uluru Statement about reparations. There is in the Uluru Statement from the heart. There's truth telling. Well, what is anyone actually against telling the truth? That's
well, it depends. Truth according to who? I mean,
that's
there's
a difficult argument to have. Sure, and that's
What's his view on reparations?
A separate question. I don't support reparations.
Will we have to negotiate that at some time?
No, look,
regardless of the voice. I mean, sometime down the track, do we face that?
No.
No? But we're talking about Indigenous affairs. We're talking about a crisis, as you've described it, which I think is a legitimate use of the word. It's also legitimate to say, if this gets up, if you get the voice, do we then turn to a treaty? What do we do then?
This... fitted on one A4 page, and I'd encourage your listeners to have a read of that.
That's the extract, mate. That's not the 26 pages of the statement. And nowhere in that extract does it discuss compensation, calculated based on Australia's GDP, to be paid to Aboriginal people once treaties are concluded. But it's there in black and white in the Uluru Statement, the full statement on page 19. Now, alongside compensation are plans for the Treaty Commission, or Makarrata Commission as they call it in the documents, to act as an umpire sitting above the Parliament in treaty negotiations.
Some of this disinformation up. What are people getting wrong?
Well, I can clearly say that you won't be asked to pay the rent. That's a really important one that seems to come up at different times across different meetings. I've had someone stand up and say that people think that they have to pay a certain amount. That's not the case. This voice is about enabling First Nations people.
He says that there's nothing like that on the table. He also asserted, though, there was no mention of reparations in the Uluru Statement, but that's not true. In the FOI document that we've got from his own National Indigenous Australians Agency, this is, of course, the document he said he hasn't read, it clearly talks about a financial statement. It clearly talks about a statement that could be calculated as a percentage of GDP. Now, I know he hasn't read it, but he can't keep making stuff up either.
Not like a politician to make something up, is it? And look, he's playing silly buggers here because, of course, when he says, well, it's not in the statement from the heart, what he means is it's not in that one page on the front, which is the public front document, and we know that he hasn't read the rest of it. Reparations, obviously, is public poison, so he wants to distance himself as far away from that as possible. But you only have to listen to all the people who were the architects of the voice to Parliament that we could have, Thomas Mayo, etc., who sat on his advisory committee, who have been saying very publicly that the voice is a vehicle to get to things like treaty. It's a vehicle to get to things like reparations. And even if you say, well, the end goal isn't explicitly reparations, we know that treaties are currently being negotiated around the country on a state level. That's another thing that Albanese's played silly buggers on, saying, well, it's no business of the feds because the states are doing it. It will become the business of the feds. But who's to say that those treaties, which are yet to be negotiated, wouldn't have included in them some form of reparations? There are 101 different ways that it could happen. So for the Prime Minister to say no, it's simply not a possibility is bunkum.
What's your view on reparations?
A separate question. I don't support reparations.
Will we have to negotiate that at some time?
No, look,
regardless of the voice.
Gotta make my mind up. Which seat can I take? It's Friday. Gotta get down on Friday. Everybody's looking forward to the weekend. Friday. Getting down on Friday. Everybody's looking forward to the weekend. Partying. Fun. Looking forward to the weekend. 7:45, we're driving on the highway, cruising so fast, I want time to fly. Fun. Think about fun. You know what it is. I got this, you got this. My friend is by my right. Hey, I got this, you got this. Now you know
some of this disinformation up. What are people getting wrong?
Well, I can clearly say that you won't be asked to pay the rent. That's a really important one that seems to come up at different times across different meetings. I've had someone stand up and say that people think that they have to pay a certain amount. That's not the case. This voice is about enabling First Nations people.
And Friday, getting down on Friday. Everybody's looking forward to the weekend. Partying. Fun. Looking forward to the weekend. It's Friday. Gotta get down on Friday. Everybody's looking forward to the weekend. And Friday, getting down on Friday. Everybody's looking forward to the weekend. Partying. Fun. Looking forward to the weekend.
The voice is just the means to the end.
Some of this disinformation up. What are people getting wrong?
Well, I can clearly say that you won't be asked to pay the rent. That's a really important one that seems to come up at different times across different meetings. I've had someone stand up and say that people think that they have to pay a certain amount. That's not the case. This voice is about enabling First Nations people.
This is from the Daily Telegraph. James Campbell reports that one of Anthony Albanese's members of his referendum engagement group is not only describing Australia as a nation without a soul, but Teela Reid, who's also a lawyer and academic, is saying this is going to be the first step, the voice, in redistributing power. And that's a direct quote, the first step in redistributing power.
Asking Australians to, quote, pay the rent with, again, quote, reparations and compensation.
You know, this is the first step. It's a vital step. Pay the rent, for example. You know, how do we do that in a way that is transparent and that it actually sees reparations and compensation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
The power in the voice is that it creates the ability for First Nations to go forth with coherent positions on what legislation needs to be created, what legislation needs to be amended, and punish politicians that ignore our advice.